the juiciest info you found out about someone, but only after they passed away. Story 1. My great-grandpa abandoned a child after divorcing his first wife. We knew about the first marriage, but no one knew about the child. His son, me grandpa, had no idea he had a half-sibling until he found the sibling's grave near the end of his own life. My grandpa had some serious problems and issues with his dad, which he had moved on from. Discovering that though reopened many of those issues, he was heartbroken and livid that he missed the opportunity to know this sibling. Story 2. We found a box belonging to my grandfather, filled with World War II medals from various countries as well as his logbook. He was in the SAF. Turns out the man was a bad war hero and just never talked about it to anyone. Even his wife. Story 3. A recluse. Older uncle that was a retired Marine. He lived in a remote city, alone, never married, never had kids, no relationships ever. We all felt sorry for him. Or so we thought. Once he passed and we drove up to clear his house, he had a shoebox filled with pictures of himself and beautiful naked women. They were printed on really nice photography paper, and the women all had their hair, makeup, and nails done perfectly. They were also dedicated in the back in cursive writing. Thank you, Joe, for the most amazing week of my life, Joe. I could never express the joy you've brought to my life. The women pictures were dated and spanned decades. We were all in shock. Anywho, my teen cousin begged for the box of pictures to belong to him. He argued that no one else would appreciate them as much as he would. We agreed and handed the box over to him with over 100 pictures. Story 4. Not exactly after he passed, but when my father was on his deathbed, I found out he was gay. My mother truly never suspected, but said it explained a lot. Story 5. My great-great-grandpa was a Basque farmer who emigrated to Cuba and became really rich. He spent all the years sending letters from Cuba to Spain, trying to maintain his relationship with a sister he was really fond of. He even spent a lot of money every year to visit his homeland and see her. Well, some years ago my family found his genealogical tree online, and there was no sister. What if actually she was a lover and not a sister? It is the most logical theory, but we'll never know. Story 6. Found out the night my brother was murdered that he was not only using meth but was also making and distributing it. No, that's not why he was murdered. Story 7. After her death, I learned that my grandmother, who appeared to be a staunch Christian her entire life, practiced some type of Satanism with her ex-husband for years. Story 8. I'm the offspring of my dad's second marriage. His family are all pretty strict Catholics, so the fact that he'd got divorced and remarried and had another child, me, was kept a secret from that entire side of the family, apart from his sister, my aunt, that is until I turned up at his funeral. Story 9. My mom recently told me that her grandma, my great-grandma, poisoned her husband, my mom's pawpaw, and the whole family knew it. They were also pretty sure she poisoned a couple other people too. It was totally in a, oh well, it is what is kind of way. Also found out that on my dad's side of the family was wild too. My pawpaw and mama divorced before I was born. They divorced because pawpaw was having affairs with women at the diner he owned. Very small southern town. Apparently, my absolute saint of a grandmother was so pissed she poked holes in all of the condoms in the condom machine at the diner. This was in the 50s or 60s. To this day, people question how many births that caused in this small town. Story 10. One of my own relatives, to me he would be a great uncle. By my calculation, he served in World War II for the Netherlands. We don't quite know exactly where and how, as there are apparently no records of it, but it was believed that he died in combat either at Fort Convertersand or defending the bridges at Moerdijk. Nobody was really sure, and I don't believe anyone really thought further of it. He had gone to fight and died, that was about it. He was survived by his wife and 3 children. One of those children sadly died quite young. Actually, the only reason I know about any of this part is because of the below. Around 1985 or so, a lady wrote to some members of our family, including my parents. She claimed to be a relative interested in her family history, and the question came up over her father, a man bearing the same name as said great-uncle. My parents immediately dismissed it and threw the letter out, as did the other members of our family who had received similar letters. Sometime later, they all got another letter, but this time with some photographs, asking if we could ask around our family about the man in the pictures. Indeed, my parents showed it around to some older surviving relatives who confirmed that it was indeed the same great-uncle. We even managed to find some photographs of him pre-war, which confirmed it all, which then prompted some family members to write back, confirming it was him and what her interest was. She came from Belgium to meet some of our family, including my uncle was on my mum's side, and from what she could ascertain, he was POW'd by the Nazis at some point up until 1942, when records went dark. Either he was still a POW throughout the whole war, or at some point escaped, nobody knows. She had managed to find some records relating to his imprisonment, but 1942 or so is when it all went dark. Notably was the lack of a liberation questionnaire. If it does exist, it was not found. The next earliest record is sometime in the mid-1950s, where he had popped up married to this lady's mother and produced her. It was her own birth record that bore his name. There doesn't appear to be anything at all between 1942 and the mid-1950s to account that he even existed. According to her mum, they were married only shortly before she was born, having met a few years prior in Germany. He had a good job, and they bought a nice house together in Belgium to raise her. Why he never returned to his wife and children in Netherlands? Nobody knows. His widow in the Netherlands was not interested at all in the story whatsoever and maintained a blanket ban on discussing it up until she sometime died in the 1990s. I never really met her, so can't really say why. I was in the UK by that time anyway. The uncle himself, this lady's father, disappeared when this lady was around 16 or so in the early 1970s. He had gone traveling to Italy for business and was never seen again. He had left everything behind, including a car he had an apparent great fondness for and featured in a lot of photos she had. Her mum would immediately shut down any discussion about her father after his disappearance. That's what sparked her to go on this family history mission herself. Her mum was aware of this mission but was pretty vocal in her disapproval. It's juicy, and there is a lot more to the story. I don't want to be boring and go on and on. Half of it is only really coming back to me now. But as for a resolution, we don't really have one. There are no records of a man of that name in a good few countries she tried in, including Italy and France. This lady has since had a family herself now, including grandkids. I have seen all of them at various family occasions. They were all at my wedding. But given she's well into her 70s by now, must be, I don't think she'll ever get a resolution on her father. At various points, her kids and even I tried to do some digging at various points, looking for death records, any other businesses he may have gotten involved in. But alas, since he disappeared sometime in the 1970s, zero. It's worth noting that before she died, my great-aunt his wife claimed that he had fought and died in Maastricht, which would have been quite late in the war. We don't believe this at all, as it simply didn't fit what records this young lady has, so it must have been an earlier engagement where he was POW'd. We believe that she wanted to maintain the idea that he died in the war, and that was that, and wanted her children to believe the same. However, confirmed at some point as apparently having seen it, one of her kids claimed she had a letter confirming that he had died in Maastricht from an official government source, but there was no other pertinent information. I don't remember what the source was, I'm afraid. We would also have expected some typical letter from the trenches action, as in him writing to her from battle. But there was nothing. So despite the apparent existence of this letter, which only a few people have even seen, none of us believe that he died in Maastricht, mainly as it doesn't explain how he popped up in Belgium 15-odd years later. I certainly don't believe this account in any case. Anyway, that's the basics of it. An unanswered question from my own family's history. It's all a big who knows, likely we will never know. And yep, I've had to trawl through a lot of other junk in my brain to get the pertinent details here and stay under the character limit of Reddit. Some of it is quite hazy to say the least. Story 11. During WW2, my great-grandfather had a whole other wife and kids where he was stationed. End of the war, he just left. Found out when Grandma was well into her 60s and the other family tracked her and her siblings down. Great-grandfather had died in an accident when Grandma was young and no one ever knew about the other family. Story 12. For context, my dad's side of the family are huge Christians. Found out my grandpa, or grandpa I should say, was actually a gay man who didn't die of pneumonia like they told me. He had AIDS, and my grandmother was fooling around with a married man who was my actual grandpa. The mistress killed my grandpa. Story 13. Great-uncle bombed France during WW2, his bomber got lost, and they had to lose weight so they could have enough fuel to make it back to England. They dumped the entire payload on some poor farmer's field. Story 14. My family is going to be surprised when I pass. I am a lifestyle femdom and a leader in the local BDSM community. My home has many tools of the trade: floggers, crops, blindfolds, and so on. Teehee. Story 15. My dad abandoned his family. This is apparently a tradition that will be broken with me, but apparently stuck around for this second family who had no idea he had another family before them. It was like I was an outsider at the funeral when I was the only blood relative. Nobody spoke to me even though I was like 16. He was this great guy to them who went by his middle name. Story 16. My uncle was a handsome, quiet man with a beard and pipe, who loved the sea. All I knew about him was he would visit and quietly and calmly sit in the corner, not saying much. He never owned a house, but he had a 4-seat plane and took us for a ride once when I was 10. He died at 66, having gone to hospital with a cough on the Friday, told he had lung cancer, died Monday, leaving behind a 24-year-old girlfriend we knew nothing about. She tried to grab his meager possessions, so it got messy in court. But then my dad told me about his younger exploits: 6 times engaged, always ran off, once to a millionaire, shot while a bodyguard in the Dominican Republic, captained a tall ship around Fiji until a hurricane scuppered it. So he came home and ran a security firm which negotiated with the Irish Republican Army in the 80s to release the owner of a chain of supermarkets. He was a target for the IRA for years, so he had police detail with him. Amongst other things, an unassuming man with a wild life. My jaw hit the floor when I heard all this the night he died. Story 17. I worked with a veteran teacher on the job almost 40 years. He had an almost magical power to get students to actually focus on academic work without seeming overbearing about it. He had an extraordinary ability to make people, kids, and adults feel seen and heard. He made you feel like he simply saw you for who you were in the most profoundly validating way. He was extremely honest and extremely kind. He was also utterly without arrogance regarding his teaching and would freely and openly admit it if he felt like he was struggling with a particular class. As a young teacher, that candor meant the world to me. Of all the people I've ever met, he's honestly the one I have admired the most. Unfortunately, he died suddenly from a brain tumor that was discovered just a few weeks before his death. For whatever set of reasons, he didn't want it widely known in the last few weeks of his life that he was terminally ill. He collapsed on the first day of a school year, was taken by an ambulance to the hospital, and most of us never saw him again. I had a colleague who was upset that he didn't let us say goodbye, but I figured it was his choice how he wanted to handle dying, and that he had given literally thousands of people so much more than most of us ever give already. At the end of that year, I was chatting with a couple of colleagues and realized that he was a person who had transitioned from female to male, probably at some point back in the 80s. This was old news to those who had known him for decades, but not that compelling in the present because it was, paradoxically, not very compelling in comparison to his amazing presence as a teacher and human being. Rest in peace and power, Christian O'Neill. We miss you still. Story 18. I had a Facebook friend HS classmate who obviously had a very checkered past. Wait a minute. This guy's almost 60 years old and has a bachelor's degree, but he's working at Tyson's on the kill floor? Something's wrong here. He died a couple years ago. He was a COVID denier, and I really think that's what killed him. And I went to the alternate internet, that is newspapers, and looked him up. I found out that he did about 10 years in prison for embezzling at least $1 million from an employer. Along with his then-wife, she got a shorter sentence in exchange for handing over extra information. In the 00s, when he was arrested, he was making frequent trips to the Dominican Republic, where he also had a mistress that his wife knew about, because he was wanting to set up a server farm there that could be used for anything, and that did include CSM if they were willing to pay for the bandwidth. Story 19. On the day of my grandmother's funeral, I learned she had been married and divorced before marrying my grandfather. This was right after WWI. Major shock. Story 20. My great-grandfather that my brother is named after is only my great-grandfather, because he adopted his niece after his sister was murdered due to her being connected to his speakeasy ring during Prohibition. Story 21. My mom died at 42. After she passed, these letters came out from her to this guy saying my younger sister was his child. He was the best friend of her best friend's son, meaning she was 30 and he was 19. This was an affair and probably the real reason why my parents divorced. My sister met him, and he ended up being a piece of, and then years later, Ancestry revealed she had relatives in common with our father, so all of that was for nothing. Story 22. Guy passed away at 57. Nice town, Private schools for the kids, Chevy Suburban, MBA from a prestigious school, vacations at the Cape. All the trappings of upper-class suburbia. He was $425,000 in debt, renting, and had no house equity. Story 23. My grandfather was tried for murdering his mistress when my dad was a kid. Didn't learn about it till after my dad and grandma had died. My grandfather, understandably, was never in our lives, but had also been dead a long time. My dad had a mistress for 10 years with whom he had a child. We found out maybe 15 years after he died when she reached out to my sibling and me. Pretty shocking. Story 24. Grandfather was part of the mafia, robbed banks, owned and ran a couple auto repair shops, had many uncles in the family that weren't actually related to us. The pieces came together when the FBI showed up at his funeral. Story 25. Old man dies. We kinda suspected he was a serial philanderer. But his wife and granddaughter find out that about the mistress who was effectively second wife for 20 years. Story 26. My great-grandma on my dad's mom's side was actually my biological great-grandma. My biological great-grandmother was very mentally unstable, likely bipolar given it runs in the family, and left with her lover during a manic episode. My great-grandfather had to raise her himself, and since he was in the military, she lived on base a lot. Story 27. My great-aunt's first husband may have been a war criminal Nazi collaborator in Poland, modern-day Belarus. However, I think the secret was that he had another family in Belarus who believed he died in WW2. He emigrated to England after WW2 and changed his name to something less Polish-sounding. My great-aunt was the sweetest person who had a horrible childhood, yet this man abused her and stole 5. This was in the 1960s from her brother, my grandpa. My grandpa apparently believed this guy knew too much about the Nazis to have been fighting on the Allied side. It turns out that Peterborough, where my aunt lived, was home to a few suspected war criminals from Eastern Europe. My journalism lecturer once got dogs set on him by an accused war criminal when he went to interview him. Story 28. I was told my great-uncle was beating the absolute out of his wife, now widow, almost daily, up into their 40s, 50s. And most of the family knew, but no one ever confronted him, and most walked on eggshells around him. Story 29. We found out my workaholic uncle was also a raging homosexual after he died. Not that being gay is bad in any way, shape, or form. He was very rich, lived in downtown Chicago, and literally like a dozen good-looking, clearly gay younger guys came to his wake funeral and were like, "Oh, your uncle?" He'd have us all over at this massive penthouse and wed party and play all night. Story 30. My boyfriend's grandpa died and he overheard her say at the funeral something like, "Finally, he will leave me alone in the bedroom." The men in his family all have insane libidos, and most have second families. Story 31. My grandfather had several properties, but when he died, his sister sold everything, leaving only a small house for my grandmother. Just thinking about it makes me angry. Story 32. My granddad was married young before he married my nan. No one knew. We still aren't sure how they divorced. When they divorced, blah blah blah. They must have been married around the start of or just after WW2 as he was a tank engineer there. And they must have split before 1950 as that's when he married my nan. Weird AF. And we only found this out after my nan died. He died 17 years before her. Story 33. My father-in-law left my husband's mom because he caught her cheating on him with her boss, amongst other things she did. Well, name her Kay. My late FIL met Kay while he was married with his first wife and had my husband's 3 older half-sisters with first wife Kay was his secretary assistant. Divorced first lady and married Kay and had my hubby and his 3 brothers. When he started dating his third and final love, he cheated on her with a coworker, caught him, and he ultimately decided she was it for him, and she forgave him, and they got married sometime after and traveled the world together. I always thought my husband's and his brother's certain way of being in relationships came from their mom. Kaya's story was the only one I knew about for a while. My FIL passed away in January 2025. To be honest with you guys, after finding all the infidelity details out, it doesn't make me feel all that confident about what the next years look like for our future. History tends to repeat itself, and that makes me feel pretty anxious. Story 34. After my uncle's funeral, we were going through his apartment with the family to see who wanted what. We asked about some photos in an album, and my father told me about a photo of a very young girl at a party that it was Peggy. She was my uncle's girlfriend when he was about 25 and she was 13. Apparently, everyone knew about it and didn't think much of it. It was the 70s. And that was just how it was. Story 35. My uncle died from a diabetic crisis. Always thought he was the weird reclusive one of the group. Turns out he abused my aunt for years. My grandparents ignored it, and my aunt became an alcoholic because of it. She's sober now, but she had a lot of therapy and wake-up calls. Story 36. Not as tragic as many, but a happy ending. 20 years after both of my grandparents on my mom's side died, I found out that my uncle, the only boy of 5 kids, was the result of an affair my grandmother had while my grandfather was deployed in the Navy. My grandfather knew it wasn't his son, but he raised him and treated him like the apple of his eye. I thought that just spoke volumes about the kind of dude my grandfather was, and I was well into my 30s before I knew. Story 37. My grandpa told us he was giving up his license. We were shocked and thought, wow, that was so mature of him. After he died, we found out he totaled his car and the license was revoked. Story 38. My grandma passed and we found out she had a whole secret first husband no one in the family knew about. Married him at 18, divorced before she turned 20, never told a soul. The way she took "don't speak of it again" to the grave? Iconic. Story 39. Apparently my grandma believed that you could only eat fruits that grew at certain heights at certain times of day. So for example, you only eat tree fruits at night or something. We think it might have been some old hippie thing, like maybe she believed it was better for one's health to only eat tree fruits at night. Story 40. Oh boy. I'm part of a folk music group that regularly meets at a local church. It's one that has a conservative take on who should marry who. I'm not down to clown with that, but the space is free. Anyway, the fellow who had been the organist and music director there for 40 years passed away recently. Everyone made comments about how odd it was that they knew Franklin was married, but they'd never met his wife. Y'all, Franklin had a husband. Bravo to Franklin. But also, I got to watch several heads explode simultaneously, and it was glorious. Story 41. My grandpa had impregnated his kid's babysitter, who went on to have the baby and raise her on her own. My grandma almost left him over this, but ended up staying with him. After my grandfather died, my grandma shared the news with her adult children because my grandpa had quietly been paying child support over the years until this child was 18, though he'd never met her, and he wanted her to have some of his things after he passed. One of my uncles had to bring her these things and met her for the first and only time. She understandably wanted nothing to do with our family, and no one else has ever met her. Story 42. We had an employee contractor from a very well-known company join a few calls, but we soon learned he had sued his former employer and lost. They ended up countersuing him for defamation, but worst of all, he had a warrant for soliciting. He didn't last long. Edit Hez still alive, but RIP career. Story 43. I spent a summer looking around on Ancestry. Calm when I was on break in college. Found a newspaper article about my great X2 grandfather murdered his wife and then tried to kill himself before he was arrested. No one in the family seemed to know, including my grandfather. I couldn't find anything else about if there was a trial or what happened to him. Story 44. My maternal great-grandparents were actually my grandfather's paternal aunt and uncle. My actual maternal great-grandmother suffered from postpartum psychosis. Her sister-in-law witnessed her threatening to kill the baby and simply took him. She and her husband raised the boy as their own, never allowing his biological parents to see him again. There were 3 other children left, and apparently they never forgave Aunt for leaving them and taking him. All 3 of his daughters and 2 of his granddaughters suffered spells of postpartum psychosis. Story 45. This is mild, but it was pretty funny to find out. When my grandparents passed and we had to clean out their retirement home apartment, we found bottles and bottles of alcohol. My grandparents hadn't drank in years due to medical issues, so we were very surprised to find that they had enough alcohol hiding around to stock a bar. No exaggeration, it was enough that it filled up a car trunk. Turns out, my grandparents were the party people of the retirement home and invited friends and neighbors over during the holidays. One of their neighbors said that the retirement home's New Year's party only went until 9 p.m., so the after party would be at my grandparents' place. People would bring alcohol to gift to them, and because my grandparents didn't drink but had the Depression-era mentality of saving everything, my mom figured they couldn't bring themselves to get rid of it and kept it for when they had friends over. It was tough losing them, but imagining them as the party people at their retirement home helped us all with the grief. Story 46. Thanks to Ancestry, my mom found my great-grandfather's second family. He had passed away when he was around 40, I think. The other family lived not only in the same town, but just a couple streets over. My grandmother was not having it. Story 47. That my cousin is a baby. My great-uncle, my grandmother's brother, impregnated his daughter not just once, twice. The first baby was secretly adopted out. They kept my cousin but lied about who her father was. My grandmother found out when I was 7. My aunt caught my cousin's mom coming out of the great-uncle's room topless. The truth all came out then, and my grandmother banned my great-uncle, his daughter plus my cousin from ever visiting us again. My cousin and I had been close up to that point too, but I never knew why we couldn't see each other. My grandmother swore the adults of the family to secrecy to never tell me or my brother the truth. I didn't find this out until my grandmother died in 2019 and my dad told me. Shortly after her death too, the first baby found me on Facebook too and confirmed the story as well. Story 48. After my maternal grandmother, she was my second mother, passed away, we found out that she was adopted. All of the family members that we have on her side of the family, her sister, her aunt, her cousins, are not actually related to us by blood. All she told us while she was alive was that her mother died at birth. We found out that that wasn't true either. Story 49. My grandma died with a lot of secrets, but accidentally let a few slip. She had a brother no one knew about until my mom was cleaning her room and found a picture of a little boy from the 30s, I think. She brought it to her and asked who that was, thinking it was an uncle. Oh, that's my brother. Brother? Yeah, he's dead now. When my mom tried to ask more questions like what his name was, she clammed up. I think we figured out he died at 8 years old. She had plenty of documents from her father's side of the family, but there was nothing about a brother, let alone a sibling. About 5-10 years later, I found documents that proved he did exist, but there was no death certificate as far as we know. There's only a birth certificate registered to her parents and no mention of him since. She was a part of a pretty prominent family at the time where the newspapers would announce when and who they were visiting since they owned the first big grocery store. She was mentioned as young as 6. Plenty mentions of her, but not one about her brother. Makes you think. Story 50. An acquaintance of mine and my husband just passed away recently. We hung out together with other couples and this man and his girlfriend a couple of times. Turns out he was married the whole time and it was his side chick. We never knew until he died. Crazy. Story 51. After my great-grandfather's death, he passed in his mid-90s. We were cleaning out his house and found a CK ring, so yeah, that was interesting. Story 52. My aunt was a second or third child. They had 6. My dad did an ancestry test and found out she'd also done it, but only half of the DNA matched. When my dad asked the oldest brother about it, he learned that my grandmother had left my grandfather for a short stint and came back pregnant. My aunt never knew. Story 53. Ooh. So a sibling of a prominent Catholic family passed away, supposedly from an unknown heart condition during a run. Family had an article in the Catholic news, etc. After his death, someone told me that they received a letter stating that said person committed suicide as he was abusing cats and was about to be exposed for it, so he committed suicide to save his reputation. Story 54. My grandma-in-law was adopted BC. Her dad died in the war, and her mom killed herself shortly afterward. At 10, she was sent to live with her aunt and uncle, but uncle is enlisted, just aunt and cousins. At 14, she is pregnant. Uncle comes home from war around the same time. Aunt and uncle raise her child my Phil as their own. Later, on her deathbed, she mentions how grateful she is that her uncle took care of her cousin for her. BC, he did unspeakable things to her. He died of a farming accident right when his dad got home from the war. People had suspected something, but no one ever said anything. Uncle was a good guy, decorated war hero, really good dad for the time. I don't know that I'd call it juicy, more like just sad. She never did mentally recover from losing her parents, one right in front of her, then going to live with people she barely knew, abuse, and then having to watch her kid be raised by family she had mixed feelings about when she was a child herself. Story 55. My never-married great-aunt was probably gay, and her longtime roommate was most likely her partner. Nobody knows for sure, but that makes the most sense. Not especially juicy, but makes me sad she had to hide her whole life when today that would be totally fine. Also, my grandma found out when she was an adult that her oldest sister was actually her mother. Story 56. Also on side note, I'm pretty sure my great-grandfather, my grandmother's dad, was secretly ex-Amish. When we did my ancestry, we couldn't find anything past him, like the trail was completely cold. Now Amish records are completely different, kept locked up privately within the Amish community and not public records, so it's almost impossible to trace unless you contact the community itself. I'm not even sure if my grandmother knew completely, but When I told my dad about this, he said he vaguely remembered mentioning something about him being Amish, but it was never discussed. Story 57. My grandfather was engaged officially 13 times before he eventually married my grandmother. When my grandfather died, we found photos and letters from ex-fiancée hidden in the back of his closet. We all assume that either our grandmother knew a portion of it or none at all. Story 58. Before he met my nan, my grandfather had gotten another woman pregnant. This woman ran off and my grandfather had no idea what happened to her or the baby. He moved on and had 2 sons. He was in hospice when his daughter made contact with us. She hasn't tried to contact us since my grandfather died. Story 59. I found out my great-uncle fathered an illegitimate child. The poor lady was raised by her mom and dad and never knew her dad wasn't her biological father until she did an ancestry test. Both of her parents were also dead, so she wasn't able to confirm if her dad knew. I found out because she found me and contacted me. My late father and I have the same name, and my dad did ancestry, and she thought it was him. This information would have been difficult for my dad as my grandfather died young, and my dad spent a lot of time with his uncle. Story 60. My great-great-great-grandfather was a jazz musician in the 20s. His wife ran a speakeasy disguised as a tea house, while her sister ran a house of ill repute brothel. They were really interesting people. He unfortunately died pretty early, but there's a picture of him with Billie Holiday, and Louis Armstrong played at his funeral. True story. Story 61. My mother died 6 months ago. My dad dropped off boxes of her stuff to me to deal with. They included boxes of baby clothes, which I thought were mine and my siblings, but it turns out they were hers. There were old, decaying folders of congratulation cards from my mum's birth, addressed to not my grandmother, who I thought was my grandmother had died well before I was born, so too, Granddad, and Mum didn't like her much from what she said. So I never got any stories about my grandparents or knew anything about them, really. I called my auntie for a WTF, and it was a complicated story about marriages, affairs, divorce, remarriages, and eventually my mum and aunt lived with their stepfather and his wife, while an uncle of mine stayed with their birth mother and father. I didn't know I still had a living bio-grandparent until I was 40, and only because he died. Mum wasn't invited to his funeral. Later, the latter two split, and my bio-grandfather had another kid, whom my mother knew about, secretly kept tabs on, but didn't tell anyone else on our side of the family. Mum's half-brother didn't even know he had 2 sisters. He found out when Mum died and word was getting around. He reached out to me directly to introduce himself. I still have no idea who Mum's mother actually was. Story 62. A collection of anecdotes. My paternal grandfather had a secret half-sister who was adopted out of the family when he was 12. They had reconnected about 3 years before his death and were emailing, but my granddad hadn't told anyone. We only found out when my dad was looking through his emails. She's actually become quite close to us since. Really nice lady. 2. Maternal grandmother's stepfather had a secret second family who turned up to the funeral. Also, my Nana only found out who her actual father was after he died. 3. Said maternal grandmother had an extensive and fairly graphic collection of amateur pornography featuring herself and several different friends in varying combinations, and I do mean it when I say varying. Also, quite a lot of self-published erotic poetry. This one is definitely the best of the 3, and I'm glad she had fun in her twilight years, but it did make going through her photo albums and filing cabinet an interesting process. Story 63. My uncle was a CPL in the Army. He was single, and we rarely saw him, always out of the country in unknown places, but when we did, he was the coolest uncle ever. My mom called the calf when their dad died. It was the way she always reached him. They told her he'd had an accident and was in the hospital where we lived. He had a serious brain injury. When she and my aunt went to visit him, there were 2 Army officers there who never left the room. When my mom said she'd go to his place to clear it out, as he was being sent out of town to recover. The officers told her that wouldn't be necessary because they had paid his rent for a year and would forward any personal belongings to her when he died. When he got out of the hospital, he came to visit before leaving town for rehab. He was a little off, but we were still surprised when he arrived with a chauffeur and another officer who stayed by his side the whole time. All this for a retired corporal? Our family decided he must have been a spy because we couldn't think of any other reason why they would not leave him unsupervised after the brain injury. Could be wrong, but if you knew him, it made sense. Plus, it's a cool family story.